Okay, just before we go into the geometry of the soul, let me just share a word from the sponsors. So welcome everybody, King's College here in Singapore, and Seminary President Reverend Dr. Michael Wieteska, and Dean of the Graduate Theology, Dr. Jengjalern, Preecha, and myself, Head of College, Gerard, Seow. We were all boat people once. Someone in our collective past had made a decision to sail. And that one decision to move out and the tens of thousands of other decisions created a movement known as the First Great Asian Migration, southward from China and eastward from India to our island over 100 years ago during the British era. So we were all boat people once. Thus, with that single idea of seeking greener pastures, did our Asian ancestors stumble off boats and sampans into this tiny rock island of Singapore, into mosques, temples, and into some churches too, to give thanks for journey mercies. Bluntly put, our forefathers were all uneducated coolies who spoke no English, barefoot rickshaw pullers and prostitutes. But through a most incredible series of events brought about not only independence from our colonial masters, but an unprecedented prosperity for an entire generation. Yes, we were all boat people once, but it was this social transformation that allowed us to enjoy the fruits of the English dialect, the milk of common law, and the honey of a well-ordered society. These three pillars were foundational to our modern state. Thus, the blood, the sweat, and tears of this previous pioneer generation was not lost to the winds of a collective forgetfulness, but forms the cornerstone of modern Singapore, complete with political consciousness and a moral conscience enshrined in constitutions, codes, and charters, coupled with a strong Asian work ethic that our forefathers brought with them on those epic sea journeys to old Singapore. Those values from India, from China, from Indochina, Indonesia, the Philippines, Borneo, Pacific, those values continue to live on in our lives, transferred from where the mountains touch the sky to where the rivers flow into the sea, and are carried forward into a new era of jet propulsion, space, tourism, and the Internet of Things. Values are indeed transferable and can be cultivated in our young, and is, in fact, the primary responsibility of the tribal storyteller, where virtue is caught rather than taught. But in the old port city, the life around the mouth of the river, the original Lau Pa Sat market before it burned down and had to be relocated to Market Street, where go-downs became temporary silos of rice and oil and other essentials. That life of old Singapore, built up one brick at a time, floor by floor, wall after wall, roof upon beam, and row after laborious row of shop houses, and through the sweat of a multitude of laborers from India and China and elsewhere, that life was undone by the bombs of an imperial squadron that turned southward in World War II history and converted the rootlessness of 1 million or so migrants into a nightmare of national privation and personal poverty known as the Japanese occupation. But again, a decision was made, this time by the LKY generation, who saw to it that whatever was past remained firmly in the past, and that the values brought over by our Asian ancestors on those ships of enterprise, of resourcefulness and common sense, would not so quickly be forgotten. Thus, the ensuing post-war pandemonium of communalism and riot gave way to the birth of modern Singapore, an independent state, though premature, without the advantage of oil or gas or any natural beauty to speak of, yet rooted and grounded in the ways of our ancient forebears, of a certain hopefulness and mental resilience that we honor in the surviving pioneers, now already in their 80s and 90s. They coached us They cajoled us, they nudged us in very old-fashioned ways. Civil order, social etiquette, the decorum and dignity of different races learning to live and let live, and a codified system of rights that protected the vulnerable based on the rule of law. Take, for example, the issue of de facto polygamy as an example of social change. In just one generation, through the example of colonial masters, education in mission, Catholic, Methodist, Anglican, etc. schools, and the process of social legislation, Women's Charter 1961-60, sweeping changes in the family structure elevated the biblical ideals of purity, fidelity, and respect for marriage and family, and wove them into a fabric of the modern Singaporean household unit. With the exception of the indigenous population under Sharia law, who were allowed to have more than one wife, the rest of the local population, Indian, Chinese, Eurasian, etc., committed to and followed after the cultural Western trend towards monogamy. It could be argued that the institution of monogamy paved the way for a subsequent generation of boys maturing into men and husbands responsible for their own sexuality and the sacredness of the conjugal union between a bridegroom and his bride. Broadly speaking, the ideal was set, and the rights of women and children cast into the legal foundations of a young nation that, after independence in 1965, continued out of respect for the same values implanted in the hearts and minds of the youth regarding the sacredness of the marital union, the subordination of passion to reason, conscience, and the eventual practical outworking of the logic of monogamy. However, as Singapore grew into the modern state that it is now, it became apparent that not all sectors of the social landscape would develop at the same pace. There was bound to be an uneven rate of progress, but it was progress nonetheless. Even the English language suffered a pigeonization or fate, resulting in our beloved Singlish, a little like how the Creoles speak French in Jamaica, or how Mother Dutch became Afrikaans in Cape Town. The unequal rate of progress within many sectors of society affected the health, education, economy, and social well-being of the fledgling nation. And while many were able to adjust to first world standards and status that prosperity brought, many sadly were unable to cope. And hence the notorious gambling dens and Geylang that fueled the vice and criminal activities of the loan sharks and snakeheads that smuggled in the girls for the purpose of the flesh trade. Thus, not all Singapore society grew in tandem with the booming economy, with some sectors scoring poorly in unemployment, teenage births, and the early disengagement of students from their teachers and peers at school. One area that our Philippines mission has had a concentration is the plight of the female domestic worker, some of whom have been formerly ill-treated, unfairly paid, or disadvantaged due to debt bondage back in the country of origin, or socially marginalized as a result of the lack of proper orientation, training, language, and cultural adaptation in regard to their stay in service in Singapore and foreign households. Of course, many of these house helpers made good and adapted. Many more did not, or fell prey to unscrupulous and criminal-minded agents. Another area that our mission has been involved in has been the trend towards abuse and mistreatment of women and girls trafficked into Singapore, speaking Sinhala, Tamil, Telugu, Hindi, Thai, Vietnamese, Bahasa, Indonesian, and Mandarin. Exactly how this kind of soiled pervertedness has come about is not clearly known, except to say that someone is obviously profiting from the street and brothel economy. Hence, our Geylang mission continues through a simple stratagem of cookies and hugs to underscore the ideals that the Bible cherishes, the ideal of the essential goodness of each and every soul without exception. Every soul is precious and ordained by God to greatness, and when we choose to walk in this calling, many people are blessed. This, at least, is an espoused value endorsed by our volunteers and the many partners raised up that carries forward tomorrow into the church of today. In this sense, we can look forward to the reward of our faith in God and blessing He has delivered through godly principles that were exported to our shores 100 years ago. This fruitfulness and fullness has compounded into the modern economic miracle we call home. It is the irony of history that the least deserving of peoples, a generation of coolies, rickshaw pullers, pirates, and prostitutes, has prospered, not because of how good or great our ideas have been, but because of eternity in our hearts put there by a people we did not previously care about, a missional empire that waxed great in the 19th and waned in the 20th century, but whose values are based on the Christian revelation that lives on in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Ultimately, Singapore is a sign and a wonder, one whose history stands as a sign pointing to the transforming power of the gospel, and a wonder, not in technological advancement, but in the core values as fathers, husbands, and sons. Yes, we were all boat people once, but today we still need to be busy moving forward into the moral and ethical values that our forefathers held dear, not turning to the left or to the right, but being steadfast in the faith, always abounding in the work of the Lord. To this end, our church pledges our energies, resources, and prayers, and into this conversation, we have allowed ourselves to participate as He supplies the wisdom, strength, and ability. To God be the glory. So today we're moving into session number 4, finding your flow. And I just gave that little bit of historical background for our students and friends outside of Singapore who may not know our story and where we came from and how we have sort of hit our sweet spot. And that's what really we're talking about today. So the ancients, they have actually 18 or 19 ways to evaluate whether a person is in his flow or sweet spot. Grammatically, these are called prepositions. And from this chart, you can actually see an orange cube within a cloud. And you remember the famous verse in Hebrews where it says that we follow the cloud and not the crowd. Well, as long as your elemental truth is situated correctly in the cloud, and you're going to be under the umbrella of the Lord, and so you will be safe. So the ancients had 18 or 19 different words. And I just want to share this with you, even if this is new to you. The first word is above. So you have various positions or prepositions in the Greek language that like global positioning system, right? The GPS of the soul, to see how far you are. Where are you now in terms of your place? Have you found where what we call your life impact? Are you able to state your life impact? And so the first word is huper, which means above. So you're not really within it or inside, but you're above, right? The next word we have is epi. So you're closer, you're on, epi. We have this word, these two words. Huper is kind of like the English word we have is super, and epi is as in epicenter. Then hupa is below. So these are 3 of the 18 words, and they kind of, and this one is para. It's beside, and you can see that. Then, of course, to be around, amphitheater. And then there's pros. And of course, in the famous John's prologue, you have proston, theos, right? So theon. So the idea of moving forward towards, right? And then into, so you're getting closer. Ice is the word. And then, of course, N is the most ideal, where you are in, where you're in Christ, where you're in your purpose, you're in your flow. And then sometimes we are moving out. So course correction is needed, ek. And of course, away from, apa. So these are different descriptive words that sort of you can ask yourself, where am I? Where is my soul in relation to that ideal state? And let's see, what else do we have? Peri, which is around, as in perimeter. We have dia, as in through, which as in diameter. And then upward, towards, or up, from ana, from above or upward. And then kata is down. All of these are frequently found words, over 500 times that are mentioned many times in the Bible. And then you have against, of course, that you shouldn't be against, anti or anti, or as in antichrist, right? You shouldn't be against your purpose. You should be flowing with it. Or pro, okay, pro is before, similar to pros, and then opisso, which is behind. So the last two is sun, is with, as in synoptics, and there are many words that begin with sun. It's together with, and then meta, which is beyond or overarching. So I think that's the 18 sort of positions that we have. And you can see that Singapore, the history of Singapore, we went through all of these different stages to where we are now. It took, a good, 50 or so years of independence, modern Singapore, but the foundation was already set there in the mission schools and through the values that were, I mentioned monogamy, I mentioned, these different traditional values, conservative values that had sort of cast the vision for us as Asian men and fathers and brothers and sons and so on and so forth. It is possible to transfer values. It is possible to train up a child in the way that he should go. And so we can move from the peripherals, or we can move closer and closer to that center. And really, if you think about your life comprising of these 19 sort of positions, what we're talking about in terms of modalities and in terms of discovery diagnostics is your elemental position, where you are as you had been created from your mother's womb. So it's really important to find yourself. I think that's the whole point of this whole series of teachings. This is our 4th session. It's called Finding Your Flow. Some people call it Sweet Spot. And it's kind of like halfway up the mountain. We're kind of like at Camp 4, but we really want to reach to the top and then beyond that. So when we are talking about finding your flow, it's really being really being centered in what you were born for, how you were wired to understand that. And lots of people have tried to describe this flow state. And one of them mentions 7 items here. In 1975, this author, I won't attempt to pronounce his name, but in any case, he wrote a book on the flow state. And he said here, he asked the question, how does it feel to be in the flow? How would you know that you're in the flow? And he mentions, number one, when you're completely involved in what you're doing, focused and concentrated, right? Just imagine someone who is riding, a 20, 30 footer wave in Waikiki Beach in Honolulu. I doubt he's going to be texting to his friend or doing email while he is riding that wave, right? Because he's totally focused on that. Hopefully he's not doing too many things at one time. You've seen some of these skateboarders doing hot dog tricks, or skiers in the Winter Olympics, and they're flying, tumbling through the air, and then they land on the other side, perfectly adjusted and balanced, and then they continue on in their fantastic acrobatics on the snow, on their snow skis. So while they're in that state, number two, they have a sense of ecstasy of being outside everyday reality. It's like stepping out of a plane, right, with a parachute, hopefully, and you just have a sensation of flying through the air. They're skydiving, right, they call it. And before you pull the ripcord, and of course, number three, greater inner clarity, knowing what needs to be done and how well we are doing it. And then number four, knowing that the activity is doable, that our skills are adequate to the task. Number five, a sense of serenity, no worries about oneself, and a feeling of growing and learning beyond boundaries of the ego. So just imagine you're 18 meters, kind of the limit of recreational diving, or even 15 meters below the surface of the water, and you are in the coral seas of, let's say, Coron or El Nido or whatever. There's a kind of, number six, a timelessness, thoroughly focused on the present. Hours seem to pass by in minutes. Think of a jazz musician who's completely immersed or baptized. The word that is used in the New Testament is baptizo, and it's exactly that. You're completely wrapped up, tangled up in God, right? And in obedience. That's really what makes life worth living. And that's how you know that tomorrow will be better than yesterday. Number seven, there's an intrinsic motivation. So even if people don't pay you for that, whatever produces flow becomes its own reward and remuneration. In that sense, you're sort of kind of like obsessed with staying in your flow. Out of all the 19 different positions that the Greeks spoke about, prepositions of the soul, or geometry or geography of the soul, there's only that one position, N, right, epsilon nu, where you are locked in to that particular state. Okay, so that's kind of like where we want to go in terms of our training. We would like you to sort of fill up this form, or this very standard coaching. How do you say this? Very standard coaching analysis. I help who? What's your target audience? Fill that up, right? It takes some time to think about this. As you develop, I mean, if you're just at the bulb state, then it's very difficult, right? If you're already in a tulip state or a budding state, then it's easier to see this. Exactly who are you helping? What is your, and here you can't say people or, everyone. You really have to focus down and see exactly who have I been wired to help. Usually it's people like yourself. It's your own type of person. But it does take some analysis or self-evaluation. Perhaps this is the highest level in taxonomy is self-taxonomy, to actually describe yourself and your purpose. Some people talk about their 2-minute elevator speech when let's say you meet someone important and they're asking you, why should I hire you? And you only have 120 seconds to answer. You should have already thought about all of these things, right? Before you get into the elevator. So exactly what are you about? This fill in the blank form helps you to analyze yourself, right? I help, right? Or if you're a couple, husband and wife team, we help who, right? And then to blank, to what? To do what? To what end? Okay? What's the goal? What's the object here? And I'll give you an example in our own case. I help, let's say, gifted individuals, right? I used to say I help pastors, but now there are so many definitions of a pastor, so I just put there, I help gifted individuals to what? Discover genius. And then your sweet sauce right at the end, your secret recipe right at the end, by modalities. Okay, so in less than 14 words, count the number. Is it okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. In 9 words. Now, your life impact statement should be less than 14 words. We're not looking for an essay here, right? So you've got very broad historical background that I've given you, right? We were once boat people, and where my ancestors came, stumbled out of junks and sampans into mosques and temples and churches to give thanks for journey mercies. That's a very broad general objective, and it's not wrong. It's historical. It's important. It honors the roots and the labors of the pioneer generation. However, for me individually, I need to know what I'm doing, and together with my wife, right? What are we doing? We are helping gifted individuals to do what? State it out, verbalize it, articulate it, think about it, and then publish it. You need to be able to decode and define and then declare out loud to everybody, right? To do what? Discover genius. And then how are you going to do it? By what? Modalities, by a signature, something. We're going to look at examples of this in different students. And here's one. In fact, Mackie's going to be back in, I think, January or so next year. And he's doing we're going to be holding an art auction, right? And he's going to be painting for a month with some other artists and some local Singaporean artists as well. And we're going to auction some of his paintings and raise some funds for King's College. So that's an opportunity. This young man, of course, rose to stardom as a, I think, 32-year-old single artist with his special technique. And here he is shaking hands with the former president, Duterte, as he was chosen to do the portraiture for that particular project. And he is also using his art for diplomacy and for peace purposes. All right. So there's many applications, but at the very core of Maki Bongabong, and by the way, if you visit us at the Singapore campus, you'll find the largest collection of Maki Bongabongs, early Maki Bongabongs, outside of the Republic of Philippines. So it's all there in Geylang in the Hebraic Art Gallery there. Okay, so we're kind of the home away from home for Maki. All right. Now, how do you go about to determine exactly, when you take a piece of paper, and I asked him to, write down exactly, that I help blank to blank by blank. This is what he came out with, right? I help celebrities, and he's helping kings and queens and prime ministers and anybody, famous people who can afford him. I help celebrities to what? To do what? To live forever. Because if you've ever seen his paintings, it's so lifelike. And it looks like a photograph, right? And how does he do it? By photorealism art, right? And it's so striking, it's so realistic. It's like looking at yourself in a mirror. So that's his secret. And so we put this in a life impact statement for him. You can do the same. Contact our office, and let's take a look at, lots and lots of people have come through our offices and our doors, and through seminars and different things. We've had the pleasure of helping couples, so many couples, with what I call is unfinished business. Okay, and we don't have time to go through them all, but what we're looking for now is, in case anybody who's hearing me, you haven't, thought about this, and you want to think about this, and we can help you. We can work with you, and this is part of, for the students in King's College, this is part of your matriculation. So in the previous sessions 1, 2, and 3, I spoke about writing out your autobiography. But and then also to get your external validations done, right? So you send to 10 or 20 of your friends this question on a short message, and it says, how have I made a difference in your life, or how have I impacted you? And then collate all those responses. This is the third document. This is the third major piece of data that you need to be bringing to the table during the one-on-one diagnostics. And you can see, I'll give you some examples in history, beginning with this guy, Mendel. Okay, if this Austrian monk who formalized the study of genetics in the 1800s using simple crossbreeding processes with pea plants, right? Mendel demonstrated the basic principles of heredity and opened up the study of genetics as a clue to the secret of life, the forerunner to the DNA genome structure. He was actually a sort of a monk who was actually prohibited by his bishop to continue all these scientific research. When he was supposed to be studying his Bible, he was actually in the garden cross-pollinating peas. So how would you describe, here's one possibility. I help vegetable farmers to grow greener peas, right? By cross-pollination. Well, in the market, if you sell green peas and you sell yellow peas, obviously the farmers are not going to be able to get rid of their yellow peas. They only want to cross-pollinate and produce greener peas, green peas, right? Really green peas, right? And how you do it is through cross-pollination. He didn't know it at that time. In fact, I think he was found out, and he was kind of like treated like a heretic. And then 100 years later, somebody found a copy of his book that hadn't been burnt by his bishop and by that monastery. And after he had been dead, and a student who was able to read the language and knew, sort of this whole way of genetic cross-pollination and so on and so forth, realized that, hey, we're looking at not just an Austrian monk, we're looking at one of the sort of forefathers or front runners of the DNA revolution, that now we realize that the human genome is far more intelligent than we actually thought. It wasn't just haphazardly put together, but exactly like what it says in Psalm 139. It says, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. So his name was Gregor Mendel, 1822, 1844, but he really was posthumously famous. During his lifetime, of course, nobody took any notice of him. That's sad, isn't it? But hey, there are a lot of people who are only famous posthumously. All right, let's take a look at this other Vermeer, this Johannes Vermeer up in Netherlands, right? 1632, 1675, going back a little bit further. He was known as the master of light. He layered dabs to paint to create points of vibrant color. And Vermeer also used the camera obscura, a dark box with a pinhole opening that projected a traceable image of an object or scene. If you've ever seen The Milkmaid, the painting, 1660, in any of the reproductions or in the actual museums itself, you can see how realistic. And so he kind of shocked the art world. Of course, a lot of critics said that actually he wasn't an artist. He was just, but really, if you look and study it really took a genius to actually come out with this methodology. And it was called camera obscura. Of course, this is the beginning of a camera, actually. So what would you say would be his life impact statement? Looking back on his life, of course, we can't interview him because he's not alive. I help still life artists, to beautify Dutch homes by camera obscura, right? Johannes Vermeer. So through this method, he was able to help other artists to really master the art of still life. All right, let's look at another guy, John Calvin, 1504, 1565. Calvin studied both theology and law and was interested in the way precise legal codes gave order to a society. And actually, John Calvin is an inspiration, one of the big inspirations in the King's College, because as it was pointed out, he really democratized the monastic experience and made it accessible for theology, I'm talking about, by the translation into vernacular, using of popular versions of the Bible, but not compromising on his scholarship. And so we can actually enjoy the fruits of monasticism without becoming a monastic, right? So all of that information and that energy and that wisdom has been codified already. And if you've ever seen the institutes of theology, Calvin's institutes, then you will know, right? So he was sort of persuaded by Luther's commentary. Another great theologian before him, Martin Luther, John Calvin, wrote a defense of Protestant teaching that is at the heart of the Reformation churches today. In 1536, he published Institutes of Christian Religion. Okay, and so how would you sort of describe his life story? I help former Catholics, perhaps, I don't know, to enter the kingdom by experiencing truth, right? He once said, quote, he said, "The Lord commands us to do good unto all men without exception, though the majority are very undeserving when judged according to their own merits. The scripture teaches us that we must not think of a man's real value, but only of his creation in the image of God, to which we owe all possible honor and love." So when we talk about natural endowments, when you go back, you'll see all of these theologians like Luther and Calvin, and even going back to Augustine, and even further back to the early church fathers. And of course, including Peter, right? And Paul, and so on and so on, John. You'll realize that actually they all believed in the innate goodness of man, and, excuse me, and that we were that God created us in his image, and it was quote unquote good and very, very good. So we were not created evil. Although the fall corrupted many things, and yet we all would agree, isn't it, that when a baby, when a child is born, that child is really born in innocence, with all the potential of good. Now, is it not true that does he need training? Yes, he needs to add to his faith virtue, right? Does he need spanking or discipline? Yes, he needs to add to his virtue knowledge. Does he need to be trained and schooled? Yes, he needs to add to his knowledge self-control, right? Does he need mentors? Of course. To self-control, you need to add perseverance. Does this child need to be taught in a school and with some structure or some curriculum? Yes, he does. You need to add your self-control. You need to add perseverance, right? Does this child need mentoring and hand-holding in the early years? Yes, of course. You need to add to your perseverance godliness, and add to your godliness, brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness, you have to add love. So at every stage of the way, we're born perfect. We're born good. In fact, God says we're very good, right? Every man, woman, and child. When you're born, when you come out of the womb, you're perfect, but that perfection has to be perfect perfection, God's perfection. And it is a process, and that's what we call life, okay? Which some have sort of humorously described as a sexually transmitted, life is that kind of opportunity to go from one level of goodness, from glory to glory. And of course, we can't do it by ourselves. We need Christ. We need the Holy Spirit. We need to be filled with the Holy Spirit. But this is the discoveries that this man had made, and many like him before him as well. And then in modern times, we have people like, Billy Graham. He started tent preaching 1949. And then, of course, his, became international. He went sort of a celebrity status due to his 1954 Greater London Crusade. And God really used him in amazing ways. He wanted to work with all stripes, all types of Christians, not just one particular denomination. He was interdenomination, or perhaps non-denominational. And so, he spoke before presidents and witnessed, Stephen apparently witnessed to the late Queen Elizabeth when she was just starting out. He was starting out as well, and they met in Buckingham Palace, and apparently from that time on, really strengthened her faith. And so you can see here the impact that one person can make. That's why we say every soul is ordained for greatness, and every community can bless God and flourish. So you don't know what is ahead for that particular child when she's born or he's born. You don't know. And so you take it seriously that, you have to train this child up in the way that he should go, right? That is a serious education, is one of the great gates into civilization, and that we have to take seriously. Education of the soul, and the family gate is another gate, right? Education and family. Okay, let's take a look at, so you could say here, Billy Graham, maybe you could say, okay, I help pre-believers, perhaps, to come to Jesus. How? By mass crusade, right? Open air preaching. So that's the how, the signature, his specialty. All right, here's another guy going back into history, 1707 and 1778, Carl Linnaeus. And by the way, each of these people have archetypes. And we'll not talk about archetypes right now because we talked about it in the last session, last two sessions. But take note that now we're talking about using your archetypes and pointing them in a specific direction with in particular contexts, whether it's academia, whether it's in social context or governance or whatever context. But this guy, he was able to very clearly make and see the differentiation between what they call kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So kingdom orders are based on cell structure and feeding methods, right? Phylum is based on body structure and symmetry. The rest are based on characteristics that are more and more specific. So this is like the geometry of the soul, but it's applied to plants and animals and things like that. It becomes extremely, the more general you are, then, like kingdom and phylum, it doesn't, it's not going to help you to hone in and zero in on exactly, what it is that you were created to do or to be, right? If you look at a dartboard, anybody can roughly hit the dartboard with a dart somewhere on the dart, right? You don't have to be, even a blind person could get the dart stuck onto the dartboard, but it really takes a lot of practice, a lot of energy, a lot of focus, concentration, and intentionality to actually get the dart into the bullseye. And I think that's what it means when it says that, all have fallen short of the glory of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We have to understand what that means. When it talks about sin, it's not talking about necessarily specific sins that grieve the heart of God, but it's talking generally about wasting your life and just not hitting the bullseye. What's the purpose? What's the job that you're supposed to do, what's the task that you're supposed to finish? What's the plan of God in your life? Is there even a plan? Can we know that there is a plan? Well, life impact coaching is not only helping you to look at the metadata, right? Your autobiography and then the biographies written by other people and the validations, right? When they hold up a mirror for you to see yourself, but also through one-on-one coaching, you're actually able to triangulate and then pinpoint not only your archetype, but within your archetype, what is your flow state given your context and the longings of your heart and the specific anointing. So you could say that Carl Linnaeus, the scientist, early scientist, he said, something like, I help science students to classify organisms by Systema Naturae, which was the name of his book, right? Or the name of his discovery, the classifications. All right, so another one is quite famous, is 1809, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln, and who led the nation, the US, through a civil war in its bloodiest, right? He abolished slavery that was limiting the potential of the American people, right? On both sides of the camp. He electrified the nation saying a house divided against itself cannot stand. Yet it was only 100 years later that this was realized. And sadly, he was assassinated while in office. And 100 years later, right, from 1863 to 1963, you got another guy who's assassinated, who is in the same order or the same classification, Martin Luther King Jr., also an abolitionist, but it took 100 years from that sort of proclamation of emancipation back in 1863. There's a lot of things we could say about Abraham Lincoln, but perhaps you could look at it in this case, right? In his life impact statement, I help African Negroes, all right, to gain US citizenship by abolishing slavery. So you have this whole group of ethnic sort of outsiders, even though they had been born, albeit in the plantation or on slave property, but they were born in America, and yet they're not treated with respect, and they're kind of like the opposite of that. Now, that emancipation came through the Civil War, and the blacks were free, but the freedom didn't really come quickly or easily because of a lack of education. So it wasn't until, all races, race, language and religion, they were given an equal footing in terms of education. Then you can compete on a level playing ground. And then you can see, oh, okay, that's why you can have a black person in America being the US president, or indeed someone of Indian descent, like in the UK becoming the prime minister. All right, so it's important, and that you really find your place in this earth, and that's what coaching is all about, right? And life impact coaching, it's what is your impact? Yes, you may know your modality, and that's already half the battle won. But then what's the rest of the battle? It's really honing in, zeroing in on how you've been wired, and then for what purpose, to what end. Okay, the last example is 1181. Wow, going back to the 12th century to 1226, 13th century, right? The guy who said, preach the gospel, use words if necessary. Francis Assisi, 1206, renounced wealth and left his father's home to preach about love and service. Okay, so this is kind of like the same Buddha story. Buddha jumped over the wall story, except that it's in a Christian context, right? And he really gave up his privilege in order to explore the creation that God had given, together with the communities that adored him and followed him, right? He was kind of like the, influencer in those days. He was like a social influencer, although he's a monk, he was a traveling monk, and everywhere he went, he just had like hordes and crowds of people, because he was so different from everybody else. Okay. And started a new order, the Franciscan order. Perhaps you could say his life statement, I help monks and nuns to live out their vows by starting a new order. Okay, similar to what Mother Teresa did as well, and why she was so famous. She actually found herself in the same way that Jackie Pullinger found herself in the old walled city of Hong Kong. Mother Teresa found herself in the ghettos or the slums of Calcutta. And sometimes we don't realize it, but favor comes to us. In fact, favor comes to us all the time. It's just whether or not you can recognize that favor, whether you can ask yourself, what free and complementary blessing am I experiencing now, and from whom? What book or resource or video is in my hand right now that I have not really understood? I'm just scratching at the surface, and if only I could get deeper, then I could really perhaps find myself. Favor falls. Favor is divine favor. It's given to all. It rains on the righteous and the unrighteous. And it rains on, but it requires you to apprehend. And of course, there are many examples of this. This is perhaps a very, very well-known figure, Nas, and we won't play the video here, but I'm sure you can find it. He would be, you could maybe say, okay, I help the nameless and faceless to gain visibility by 1 minute videos. That was his kind of forte that he had. I don't know if he knew what he was going to do when he was attending school, but favor came to him, right? And he kind of made himself a fool, and he traveled around, kept on traveling and making these 1 minute videos. Another example is Ittai Talgam, this Israeli conductor, who is a sort of he uses his knowledge of music and organizational behavior to teach businessmen. So you could say that for Ittai, I help business leaders to lead better by studying maestros. So he teaches about how to be a conductor, and then he gives you all the examples of how conductors do their stuff, right? As a conductor, how do they conduct orchestras, the different styles, and some of the business leaders who listen to him can pick up tips and tricks from the mistakes and from the victories of these maestros. All right. Another one that we met and came to Singapore as well was this guy by the name of Peter Jasek, and he was imprisoned. We're not going to play the video here. You can go and Google for him in the Czech Republic, and he went through tremendous persecution, similar to the other guy. His name eludes me now, but the guy who was in prison in the Soviet Gulag, and then when he came out many years later, he went to America, and he said, "Wow, I thought it was difficult being in prison because I had no choice." Right. Then he went to America, and he saw in the grocery stores, you have so many choices, even of a simple thing like toothpaste. And he was saying, well, it's not so easy. Freedom has its own challenges as well as totalitarian dictatorship. But Peter Jasek had this similar kind of privation experience and, solitary confinement and so on and so forth. And when he told his story, what came to my mind is, I helped my jailers see the light, right, by enduring torture. So the longer he was there, the more he was a witness to his jailers, and eventually he was let out. And then the last example, and I think we'll close with this example, is of Barbara Scheer. She has this incredible, a very simple idea that if you got people together and they were transparent and vulnerable with each other, that the group itself, within the group, everything that you need is to be found within that ecclesia or within that group, as long as you don't isolate anybody. And how do you not isolate anyone? You have to set the tone and the mood. She's kind of like, without knowing it or without saying so, she's kind of like at the forefront of group dynamics. If you ever want to know how to be a small group leader in the microchurch, for example, go and look up this lady called Barbara Shear. I think she's actually an Elios, because of the way that, she believes that she can help people with wants to actualize it by killing their isolation. So in group therapy, she believes that somehow every member within that ecclesial group or that oikos group can have its needs met by somebody else in the group, as long as there's a freedom to share openly without any fear of reprisal or condemnation or getting scolded, basically. That means somehow I have the key for you and you have the key for me, something like that. And it's just that we don't know that together we can go further than if we want to, just go by ourselves. So take a look at Barbara Shear. You can Google for "Isolation is the Dream Killer, Not Your Attitude." There are many videos. It's very hard to actually interview these people. Some of them have died, obviously. But you just read books and you see documentaries about people like, Helen Keller and Margaret Thatcher and Queen Elizabeth and so on and so forth, and Mother Teresa and so on and so forth. You can actually learn a lot from what's already out there and do your own research. This is, as I mentioned last session, this is really called heuristics. And you just see very, very successful people, and not just athletes like, Tiger Woods, not just basketball players, tennis players, Federer and so on and so forth. Artisanal people, yes, okay, I understand the 10,000 rule, but what about other modal excellences? How does the Elios, the firefighters and the policemen and the loss protection officers and paramedics and so on and so forth? What about explorers like Shackleton and others who endangered their lives, and people followed them and they didn't mind to die on the mountaintops or risk their lives in the high seas, simply because the adventure was a reward in itself. How can you account for all of human behavior and create what we call the periodic table of human formation? The sort of the meta narrative that we're talking about here, we call it human formation. And so over the next 10 years, our plan is to have an institute for theology, for the family, and for human formation, and to study all of these things in a public discourse. And that's what Series 4 is about, finding your flow. I hope you've enjoyed this session. And we will see you in session 5. We will see you in session 5 when we look at a deep dive. We're going to take a deep dive into discrete revelation in the patterns of 7. So that's going to be very interesting in terms of history and literature of the Bible and the history of the Jew. And you're going to see lots of secrets that are not on the surface of Scripture. But nevertheless, if you look at the deep structure of scripture, of revelation, you'll be able to see some amazing fractals in scripture that's going to give you clues to your own future and open the door